Thanks everyone for joining so far, and there'll be more people joining as we kick off. But today we're here with the Small Business Minister, Paul Scully, to talk about the government's support for independents and to voice questions from our community that have come up. As many of you know, the impact of COVID has been especially severe on the small business community. However, small businesses, and particularly retail, play such a crucial role in our economy. Retail is the largest employer in the private sector. SMEs employ 60% of the working population. And importantly, around 63p in every pound spent with independents stays in the local economy compared to nearly half that with larger businesses. COVID, I truly think, also gave us an understanding of the people behind those businesses, appreciation for the entrepreneur, a realization that every store, cafe and restaurant represents someone's dream. It's ultimately about their livelihoods. My mum came to the UK from Jamaica, and her shop that she would turn into a hair salon gave her the opportunity to send me to a good school. My dad's store gave him the first step to moving out of his family's council house. And as I drove past empty shops shuttered up over lockdown, it dawned on me the effect this would be having on families that those stores and each store ultimately supports. At Appear Here, we also believe that stores and streets in many ways are the fabric of our cities and our towns. You don't love living in a city like London for the cathedral, the art gallery, or the theatre, as great as they are. They're the 1%. But the 99%, the fabric of our cities, I truly believe, where we connect, make memories and interact with each other, is our shops, cafe and restaurants. They stitch together our streets and they ultimately bring us together. And I think that COVID didn't just take away those places, it took away what those places do, which is human interaction. And I truly believe that people will crave and will continue to crave that more than ever before because it was taken ultimately away from them. So stores, we believe at Appear Here, I believe strongly, are vital for our economy. They are vital to a healthy society. And more importantly, they're vital for a diverse culture where different voices can contribute. We believe that we need to protect small businesses to ensure our high streets don't just survive, but coming out of this, they actually thrive. So in this event, we hope to hear how the government plans to support those independents. So I'm delighted and very thankful for Paul giving up his time to introduce Paul Scully, the Minister of Small Business. Paul's been an MP since 2015. Before joining Parliament, ran his own small businesses and is responsible not just for small business, consumer and labour markets, but also as Minister for London. Paul, thank you for having us, and thank you for your time and being here today.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you, Ross, and it's a pleasure to to share a bit of time with independent businesses. As you say, they really do make up communities. They make up. I mean, for my London role, yeah, we've got the middle of London to get back up and running. The city that you were talking about, that sort of world city, and there's so much there. 3% of the entire UK economy just sits in the West End. That's before you get to the city and financial sector and these kind of things. So it is important that we get that city up and running as well. But London is made up of something like 600 odd high streets with those independent stores that you retailers, hospitality and cultural sectors that you've been talking about. And then you can replicate that around the country in Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, but also the villages and towns around the country as well that really thrive on independent stores who know their customers better. They know their area better. They can respond with the right support. Furlough clearly is the business word of this year, but I'm really hoping that pivot is going to be the business word of next year, because I've heard some great examples where independent stores and independent businesses who might not have the resource to get stuck in straight into some of the big support without us pushing it towards them, but they do have the agility to change as the market changes and they find different opportunities. So we've done a load of work, as you know, with the Job Retention Scheme, the CBIL scheme, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, which actually does end at the end of 30th of September, but it helps SMEs with a turnover up to 45 million quid. And in the bounce back loan, there's plenty of time to apply for that as well. That's obviously 100% guaranteed by the government. And with the interest free for the first 12 months. And there's also time to apply for the second tranche of the self-employed employment income support scheme that remains open for applications to the second and final grant to the 19th of October. So we really want to make sure that we can get that through to people that need the help, but also then move to the job retention bonus scheme. So all the people that you've managed to protect in employment to support you bringing them back to work. So we'll give £1,000 for every employee that was on furlough that you retain within employment until the end of January.
Right.
So these are the kind of things. Yeah, so I'll leave it up to you. I'd love to answer your questions, Ross.
And with the so the community have put together questions already. And for those watching, if there's any more questions, if you go into the live chat, you can put in the Q&A. We'll be checking those, and I'll be being told which questions to ask. But Paul, one thing that really came out was that current support. What is there available? You've just touched on a few things, the bounce back load, the furlough schemes. I want to cover those a little bit more in a moment. But are there any other things that people should be looking at right now in terms of current support? Obviously, you just went through quite a few. So is there anything else, or is that now covered?
Yeah, I think that they're the three main ones that are live at the moment, because so you've still got the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, which is coming to an end, and it's been phased out until the end of October. But I think it's right now that as we start to open the economy, we can't mothball the economy forever. As you said, we've got to make sure that it can thrive as well as survive. But we can only do that by opening up the economy in a sensible, proportionate way, giving people the confidence to come back, but also the joy. So the confidence means that, breaking down the barriers and the fears that people have got about public transport in some of the city centres, for example, but also the joy. You guys give them the positive experience that they hope for, then they'll come back time and time again. So that's why we're phasing it out, but it's there until the end of October. But apart from the schemes that I've talked about, if you are unsure about what you're eligible for, there is a business support website that you can go on the gov.uk website. Couple of short little details, and it will illustrate everything that's available for you both now and in the next stage.
Awesome, thanks for that, Paul. So look, you've covered this, and you sort of just briefly touched on it before you went into the schemes, which is the importance of the high street. You guys have launched a campaign recently, which is about driving people and trying to encourage people back to the high street. I just touched to you on, in my opening remarks, why I think that shops are so much more than just the economic activity, which they're vital towards, but also making our communities and making our cities places that we want to live in. So why is the high street important? And what do you think we can do to encourage a revival of our local communities and ensure that our high streets don't just survive during this time, but do exactly what you said, which is also thrive?
Yeah, well, I mean, the local high street, we talked a little bit about the fact that it really is the community. It's the heart of the community, that people coalesce around that, because the people that work in those independent stores are residents themselves, often of the local area. The employees come in there, they will know people by name, by face, and they can respond so much better. So if you start to hollow out that high street with empty shops either side, you really do risk hollowing out communities, which is the last thing we want to do. So the government's first priority has always been to save lives, but restoring livelihoods, protecting businesses, and therefore protecting high streets is so crucial. The high street, we've had this conversation for years now. What's the high street going to look like in terms of, with the pressure of rates and rent, with the pressure of online? But that's been accelerated now, and it's really shaping our local area. That's why we talked about we had a shop local scheme over the summer, promoting these sort of things, showing, not telling people what the benefit is of shopping in your local area. We talked about enjoying summer safely as well, where we tried to make it easier for pubs, restaurants, cafes and that lot to expand the hospitality sector, to expand their premises outside onto the pavement, give them easement on licenses and those kind of things, so people can come out
amazing in some areas
and socially distance in a safe way.
So look, I mean, you just touched on why you think those streets are important. I think one thing that's, and you just sort of mentioned about the acceleration of what COVID's done, and we are seeing that, right, with a lot of those big traditional retailers falling apart and obviously vacancy rates rising. But what I think has also been interesting during this time is you're seeing local neighbourhoods. We're seeing boroughs of London, areas like Deptford or different areas within Hackney, where actually people are finding their sales are up on where they were pre-COVID, and that there's sort of this revitalisation of local neighborhoods, you're seeing that streets with a high proportion of independent stores are doing far better than those stores with more of the cookie cutter stores. There was a great article last weekend in the FT about Pret, and yet the rise of the independent coffee maker. The question I've got to you is, although there's this conversation about the decline of the high street, and that's all we're sort of seeing in the press, on the flip side, you briefly mentioned before about this idea of pivot. And I was sat yesterday and I saw a guy who had an online wine shop. He had to shut his wine store. He opened an online version of this wine shop, and his sales are up 70% on last year. He's completely pivoted his business. And yet he saw me and he said, look, I want to open up 6 or 7 more sites in the next few weeks. And I was like, well, why do you want to launch more offline when your online's killing it? And he said, well, actually, the online sales I'm getting are only in the boroughs and the areas where I had a physical storefront. Daily Paper, an amazing online fashion brand, have found that every time they open a store, their online sales increase by 300%. So the question I've got for people is, like, the narrative at the moment is that offline retail is negative. The narrative is that it's not working. And yet we're witnessing stores opening up in these local high streets that are thriving, that are doing better than ever, and that are opening up more stores. What can we do to get that narrative out there? And what are you trying to do to make that happen?
Yeah, so there's the first bit. I talked about the confidence. So let's talk about the confidence first. That's really showing people how it's all of the workplace guidance that we've helped alongside business to develop and put in place. Those retailers have worked so hard to make sure that you can have both a secure and a warm welcome, so that you still get the positive experience, but you can go in there feeling safe. It's showing people, and as I say, giving people the confidence to be able to do that. But then it's about highlighting exactly that sort of example that you were talking about, Ross, about where, why having a local specialist shop really can add value to online. You can, if you get it right, you can meld both together. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you a great example. I have bought wine online. And the company that I buy online from, or typically buy online from, they also have shops. And there's nothing quite like going in there and speaking to someone, having the conversation with them. So I tend to like this. Have you got anything else? You can have longer conversations rather than just clicking through a whole list of wine. So it's convenient online, but you get the personalization offline in the high streets. And I think getting that right is what that community that I was talking about is all about.
Right. And Paul, a minute ago you said, look, the worst thing we want to see is vacant, empty shops in between things. That's not good for society and for our streets. Retail vacancies, because of the accelerations we've just mentioned, and because of people that are struggling, retail vacancies are now at the highest level since 2014 and predicted to go higher, with 1 in 10 shops already empty. Or, our high streets were struggling before the crisis. We've said that COVID has only accelerated that. A lot of the response stuff that you've mentioned, the furlough, the bounce back loans, all of these things, in many ways, they're set up for businesses that have already existed. One question just came through on the Q&A that said, look, fundamentally, the government's making it harder for SMEs to take up the Kickstarter scheme because you're requiring a minimum of 30 employees per business. So the sort of question I've got is, existing businesses aren't going to necessarily fill those empty stores. The furlough scheme's about to come to an end, where we've got, touching on what you said, we're moving from this humanitarian crisis into very much an economic one, and we're going to have huge unemployment. What can we do, and what are we thinking about doing to encourage people to start up and create and fill these stores? Because if they're doing as well as you and me believe, then surely there's an opportunity here to encourage people to take those empty stores and do something with them, and to encourage people who don't have 30 employees but who want to have 30 employees one day to actually begin and use this time as an opportunity to start versus just survive. And I think it was your word saying we're moving from this idea of survival into recovery.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Ross, and for that question. So I think the point is, in terms of, Kickstarter, as you say, is, working with established businesses primarily, but there are opportunities for apprenticeships and trainees as well that we're putting into place. In terms of the startup, there's 2 things I would suggest. The British Business Bank has been going on since 2012 now in offering startup loans. It offered its 75,000th startup loan just a couple of weeks ago to a small bakery startup in South Wales. And so, it's a primary great way of access to finance that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise thought of. And in terms of, there's also, we've got the Future High Streets Fund. And what that helps to shape the high street to respond to communities. Now, what can you do with that? There are lots of good initiatives that are funded by government or local authority budgets to help the meanwhile stores, the pop-up stores. That allows you to go in. If you've got a great idea, but you're not quite ready yet, you're not sure if you're ready yet to actually go and take on a lease and all of the things those fixed costs that starting up a retail business entails, you can go and try it. So it's good to link up with your local authority, with the local growth hub as well, through your local enterprise partnership. Sometimes difficult to access all of these different acronyms and business support, which is why we're trying to consolidate it. So if you go to that business support helpline that you were talking about, that I was talking about, the website on gov.uk, you'll be able to find out where your local growth hub is to get that consistent business support that I'm really keen that we have and improve right the way across the country.
Yeah, and another question just come through was someone mentioned the business bank. But sort of said, like, look, still they require some level of history versus starting fresh. So it feels like maybe there's a bit of a gap there with what's happening at the moment, and maybe, Paul, that's an opportunity to come up with ideas separately.
Sure.
But going back to this, it says that one sort of question we just had come in that says more about confidence and the stuff that you just touched upon, that recently a store owner said the council has told local residents not to socialise with people they do not live with in other outdoor public venues such as shops. So they've worked hard to be COVID secure. They've put in all the right measures. They've got their staff wearing PPE and all of those things. And now the council is basically telling customers essentially not to shop. There seems to be mixed messages here. What would be your advice to that entrepreneur that sent that in?
Yeah, look, I think it's really it's difficult when you work through the media and you see some of the things and interpretations of what's going on. Essentially, nobody wants to see a second overall lockdown. I think that economically that's hugely difficult. What we've seen, that we saw the lockdown in Leicester, and we learned a lot of lessons out of that. It's because it was springing up in a few different places, but now we've got improved data so that we can put in certain measures in certain areas, and we can look at the boroughs around London, we can look at the area towns around the country to see where we might need a little bit of intervention to stop it getting to that point. And so that's getting more sophisticated, and the financial support will follow. But essentially, what we're talking about at the moment in terms of stopping gatherings, of 13 going down to 6, is because so much of the infections that are coming up that are fueling that increased infection are from informal gatherings. It's people meeting in extended households. It's people meeting, all thinking that's okay, let's just go out in the park and have, a good few dozen, whether that's, right away from the illegal raves through to just kids enjoying themselves, but not doing it in a socially distanced way. Retailers, on the whole, have put all these measures in place, whether it's hand sanitizers, the hand space kind of ideas about making sure you're washing your hands, making sure you've got the masks when you're going into shops, which is mandatory, and keeping that social distancing distance where possible. So retailers have put a lot of work into that. And so it's really important to emphasize that the increased infection is not happening because of shops, it's not happening because of offices. And so that's back to that confidence thing. You should feel confident to be able to go and shop in your local high street.
And we've sort of covered on this or partly already, but small retailers traditionally find it very difficult to access the high street. With almost half of UK SMEs starting to accessing finance is a big barrier for them. You mentioned about the British Business Bank and other things like that. Encouraging new businesses to our high street is going to be essential to the economic recovery, as you've pointed out. What plans are in place to assist with this, or are those what you've mentioned with the meanwhile scheme and the business bank?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about the startup, the startup loans, and of those loans, 40% of those went to women entrepreneurs, 20% to business owners from a BAME background. So it's good that we're sort of trying to sort of widen that up to people who have. In terms of women entrepreneurs, I'm doing a thing called the Rose Review with Alison Rose, who's chief exec of a major bank, to make sure that people who have traditionally either found it hard to access finance or have been reticent about doing so, actually have a pathway to be able to secure that. The Kickstarter scheme we've talked about, but businesses also will be able to get £2,000 for every new apprentice that they hire under the age of 25. So encouraging new people, young people back into to work. That's in addition to the existing £1,000 payment that the government already provides to new 16 to 18-year-old apprentices. And so these are key things around the support that we want to give small businesses and small retailers now. But there is an issue. I talked about pop-up shops because there is an issue, ongoing conversation that we need to have about high rents, frankly, on high streets. In terms of rates, we're doing a fundamental business rates review to make it far more equitable and approachable for businesses to get a footing on the high street, to make sure that there's that they can see a direct correlation between what they're putting in to their local area and what they're getting back as a result.
Yeah, and I mean, look, from a rents perspective, we've already started to see on a bit here, rents have fallen by about 30 to 40%. So that is giving people at least starting a new opportunity. And I think the access thing is interesting because for a bit here, although a lot of it's pop-ups at the beginning, we've seen, especially during lockdown, a huge amount of those become long-term stores. And what's interesting is, I guess, the pop-up is access. And we're seeing that 70% of those stores being launched are by female entrepreneurs. And by giving people access, you really are seeing a different kind of diversity to the traditional high street. What additional help, though, we talk about rents going down, are you going to be giving not just to brands, but also landlords to ensure they stand a chance in 2021 and beyond? Going forward now, as we come out of this and we do move from this survival place to a place of how do we recover, what are we doing there for both sides of the equation?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about the fact that, undoubtedly this is going to be a tough time. Make no bones about that. But I think the key thing for retailers, as I say, especially independent retailers, small businesses business owners tend to work on their business or for their business, should I say. They find it difficult to find the time to work on their business, to get that sort of thinking time, that space to actually plan for the future. So we try and make it as easy as possible. There is a business support finder tool on the gov.uk website that I was talking about, which I really encourage you to go onto, which just takes minutes to complete, and it will find the support that you can get for the business. But essentially, the next job is to focus on creating jobs and to be able to grow the economy. That's sort of the things that we've been talking about over the last few minutes. But we've built in a code of conduct. So working with landlords and tenants to make sure that at this particular point in time, they can have sensible conversations to try and get a middle road that can benefit both landlords and tenants. Because frankly, if you're able to, if you are getting the footfall, you are able to pay, then landlords who invested money, if we want to keep them investing in the high street, then it's important.
And many people seem to forget sometimes that you sort of look at landlords as sort of big bad wolf. And I think what many of us often forget is that most of the finance in real estate is everyone's pensions. So exactly, we often forget that when we're looking at the and it's a big, I think, area that's not talked about, which is that if our high streets collapse and retail collapses, it's historically been the biggest investment in pension funds, and that's going to be an issue for every one of us that's contributed there. So a thing that's quite interesting and people are talking about is, back to high streets, the idea of community ownership and things that drive the community and that local area from not just an economic perspective, but a society perspective that you touched on at the beginning. The US has an approach for financing for new businesses with 100% tax deductions when someone's doing something very local and investing in their high street. Someone's asked the question of, can we look at doing something similar there? And then to expand that question a little bit more as well, communities are the heart of our high streets. However, there's a big lack of awareness of community asset ownership, somebody's asked and said, and this idea of members of the local community coming together to create small, viable and profitable businesses. My office where I'm sat now is in Clerkenwell, and on Lamb's Conduit Street, there's a supermarket that's owned by the local area, as well as a coffee shop. How are you planning as a small business minister to view the role of local residents perhaps owning a piece of the high street and contributing in a far more meaningful way to this mission of shop local? And they're two questions that have come from the community.
Yeah, that community asset ownership is really, really good. It's a really good point, because there are some great examples. You've mentioned that one, and I've heard of that one. There's also a pub, for example, in my local area, which has had a lot of problems a good few years ago with drugs and trouble and all these sort of things. It actually got together with a load of members of the community who really valued having the pub in their area. They didn't want to see it shut down permanently. And obviously, you know, with pubs, once they're closed, often they change use and you've lost them forever. And now it's a really successful pub. It wins the Camera South London Pub of the Year competition nearly every year. So community getting involved can have a really beneficial input, not just for that business, but for the high street and their local area as well. We're trialling an open doors pilot in 5 town centres to try and bring back empty properties by matching landlords of vacant premises and local community groups. So since that started in July 2019, we've had 43 community groups benefiting from such spaces. So these are kind of initiatives that I do want to build on, exactly as the questioner was talking about, to making people more aware of community asset ownership and see how that can progress.
One of the final questions that's come through, someone has asked and said, look, you know, they've got an independent store in central London. Footfall, as we can see, FT had stats out this weekend, 80% down nearly on where it was pre-COVID. Yet their landlords are demanding that they, you know, still owe the rent that they haven't paid. You know, what can government do to give those entrepreneurs support? Because, you know, if you've got 80% less customers, clearly those businesses can't afford those rent levels. And that's a huge issue of coming out of this if they also want to recover. So what are you guys planning to do there? And what can you do to give people confidence that they're not going to be kicked out and lose their businesses?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, the code of conduct that I talked about is working reasonably well in a lot of cases, but it's a code. It's voluntary. It's not mandatory. What we've also done is we put a moratorium on landlords, because what some landlords were doing was they were just saying, like, they were trying to evict their tenants. We said, no, you can't do that. So they were going to the next stage. They were going to the next aggressive rent recovery, which is basically to put in a statutory demand to a court. And then once they've done that, they will be able to start a winding up petition, because the statutory demand, basically, if successful, says you can't pay your bills. The winding up petition is the next stage on that. So we said, you can't do that. Well, let's have a moratorium. So we forced those landlords to hopefully go back and have a more reasoned point of view. That's not working in every example. But I would urge landlords to actually realise that if you've got an empty building, that's no good to you either. You're not getting your rent in. So it's so much easier and makes long-term sense to be able to have those conversations, which is not as easy if the landlord is the pension schemes that you're talking about and some of or an absentee landlord that's got a big portfolio. But often, don't forget, the landlords are not, maybe that's the case in central London, but in some of the outer London high streets that we've been talking about, some of the landlords have just, 1, 2, maybe a dozen properties, and it is easier to have that conversation. Say, well, look, you know what? If you don't have me, you're going to find it hard getting another business coming in at this particular point in time. So better to make a sensible deal and compromise.
Okay, we're at 11, so maybe one final question. Someone said that, look, we're struggling with COVID, we're coming out of this, and now there's discussions of a no-deal Brexit. How do you feel that will affect independent retailers, and are we on course for that?
Well, we're coming up to the sharp end of the negotiations, clearly, and we're still working at pace to make sure that we can get a deal. We want to get a deal. It makes sense to be trading well with and freely with our nearest nations, trading nations. So we're working at pace. Negotiations are literally going on today as we speak. But we've got to be ready to say, you know what, if we're not going to get what we need out of it as a country, then that we do need to be ready to step away. Appreciate the fact that this is not giving businesses the certainty it wants, but we are working with businesses, and again, especially smaller business, do go on, look at the government advertising and making sure that you're looking at the advice that's coming through, that you subscribe to the email that will actually give you the real-time information so that you can prepare as best you can through your supply chains, because it's the supply chains that will most likely affect independent retailers.
Great, thank you, Paul. And look, to finish off now, we touched on this before, but over 5 million people are predicted to become unemployed this year as the government furlough scheme ends in the next 6 to 7 weeks. Will not only be a huge impact on the economy, but we all know that as humans, this idea of purpose and doing what you believe in and all these things is important for mental health and things like that. But there's hope. From previous recessions, we've seen a huge surge in entrepreneurial activity. We've seen that retail businesses created in the last recession were twice as likely to survive and so on, and were more resilient. It feels like at the moment, a lot of the things we've covered are for existing businesses, are for retailers that are already there, for people that already have a number of employees. Yet at the moment with Appear Here, we've seen a surge in demand of higher phone calls than we've ever had, higher requests of people wanting to begin, people that are unemployed that are using this moment to question, that plan B or that plan C that they had. How does that become their plan A? How do they do something they believe in and have that sort of hope? And I guess we sort of had the opportunity where we spoke about it before, but is there anything that the government is doing right now to help those individuals at the beginning of their journey who found themselves unemployed, who are looking at something and saying, hey, I want to start? And if not, is that something that you're willing to consider and look at?
Yeah, so first of all, if you're going to start a business and looking at this, don't forget that we are actually doing really well in terms of the progress around vaccination. But we can't base an economic recovery on the fact that there's going to be a vaccine in 6 months or whatever. So, we need to look at how we are living with the vaccine from an economic recovery point of view. What are we going to do? Just say, I don't know, just pick a figure out there, 2, 3, 4 years time. This may still be with us. Hopefully it's not, because as I say, it's happening at pace. So if you're starting a business, that's where to go. What can I do to be able to have a sustainable business that starts up with the vaccine around live? But then I talked about the startup loans, talked about the fact that we're partnered with an organisation called Enterprise Nation, who are delivering a lot of great business support. I'd ask you to have a look at what they're doing there as well. With this so much of the business support is not just the access to finance, but it's peer-to-peer network. So actually we between Enterprise Nation, Be the Business, all these other great organisations that we're working with, you can find them all through your local growth hub. Then you're actually finding business support for people not just right at the top of retail. It's not about if you're starting a small shop finding the chief exec of Sainsbury's. It's actually finding someone that's just maybe done 6 months, a year down the line from you that has just solved some of the issues that you're now facing. So that is all available to you now. I'd ask you to go and search that out. But just as I say, remember that this is not a recession like a financial crash, which happened, we then recover. This is an area that's still ongoing because we're learning to live with the virus for the reasons that we said right at the beginning about the changes in restrictions, and hopefully that's why we don't want to go into a national lockdown again, but things may change in certain areas in certain ways. So that's what we've got to be alive to that, and that's if you're aware of those risks, then you can manage those risks. That's what any small business owner needs to do.
Cool. And look, I think that as depressing as things have been this year and what we're going through is seeing a rise in vacancies, I think that what we are also seeing is that many of the big traditional cookie cutter stores are disappearing, and that isn't great, but what it does leave is an opportunity for smaller businesses to thrive, and we're already seeing that in our community. We're seeing a rise in people wanting to start stuff from the beginning and being entrepreneurial. We're seeing in the US and Canada the government launching new schemes with enterprises like Shopify to help encourage people to set up businesses. I think that seeing that now positive message and seeing what the government can do to push that, I think, and that message about being that this isn't just about survival, but it's also now about how do we recover and thrive and potentially end up with high streets that, as you said, we've been struggling for 10, 15 years on the question of what does the high street look in the future. And in many ways, I think with lockdown and people being more closer to home, you've started to see the things that the high street does do and the importance to human connection and the importance of those local entrepreneurs and what they do to make our cities worth living in. So we're optimistic and we're excited for the future. And Paul, it'd be great to, I think, see from all of this conversation, it feels like there's a lot of great initiatives. It feels like there's a lot to be done, but it feels like there is a gap there for people getting started, and especially a gap there for those individuals that are currently finding themselves unemployed. And obviously from the questions we've seen, there's still a big concern from people on landlords and rent levels.
So Ross, can I just say before we go, look, it's important that we showcase the great examples that we've been talking about, so we can see, because then you can pass that information down and that will inspire other people. But I do want to know about the inconsistencies. So because we've talked about making the UK the best place to grow, to start and grow a business, I want to go further than that and make sure that it shouldn't matter where in the UK. It should still be the best place to do that. So very regional, very consistent business support.
Sure.
But I'll only know where those inconsistencies are if I can hear those from you.
Yeah, well, let's have that conversation. I think that the matched funding that was just done for startups, for example, you know, we benefited from that, but it was very technology focused. I think it would be great to see stuff like that for much smaller businesses getting started, for the vital role that they also play. Paul, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being honest with your questions, and we'll be in touch if there's any further questions. I know that Paul and his team have kindly agreed to answer more questions on our next newsletter. It will be being sent out to everyone. So appreciate the time and thank you.